Good. So, hey, thanks for coming tonight. Come on in. We still have room and time. Come on right in. It's always better to have a crowd, isn't it? I mean, I'm so used to going to a place where I have to use the old line from Milton, fit company though few. And that saved my ass about 300 times, you know. I have a colleague who once went to give a talk in the Midwest somewhere, and he got there, and the English department chairman said, "I'm afraid I'm going to have to introduce you and run. I have to go to a meeting." He said, "Well, that's all right." And he got to the auditorium, which was a huge auditorium, but there was one student. And he asked my friend, "Should I go ahead?" My friend said, "Yes, if there's one person there who wants to hear me talk, read my poetry, I'll go." So he comes out and the guy introduces him and he leaves. And my friend starts reading and the hand goes up from the student. And he figures, well, that's a bit odd, but only one student and he has a question already. "Yes, what's your question?" He said, "Is there any chance that you could maybe read your poem somewhere else?" He said, "I was hoping to study in this room." Which is by way of saying that the humiliations of the writer's life are endless, and they go on and on and on. In fact, I was speaking of Robert Frost. I was at a meeting of, I got some award, a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Italian American Foundation in Washington. I was sitting next to Yogi Berra, who also got one that night. And I said, "Yogi, I was just teaching that Robert Frost poem, Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening at Middlebury College, where I teach, and I mentioned you." He said, "You mentioned me in a college class?" He said, "What did you say?" I said, "Well, I was quoting your famous line, which really fits with the poem. If you come to a fork in the road, take it." He said, "Jay, I said that, but who the hell is Robert Frost?" I said, don't you read poetry, Yogi?" He said, "I only read the one poet, Phil Rizzuto." So Phil Rizzuto. And then, as if on cue, Phil Rizzuto came over to us and said, "Somebody calling me?" He was Italian as well. So, and a poet. No, not quite Dante among Italian poets. So, these are stories of the humiliations of the writer's life, but Frost really understood the humiliations of the writer's life. Think about it. First of all, his first 3 poems were published when he was like 30 years old, finally got a publisher for his poems. They appeared in Poultry magazine. I didn't say Poetry magazine. I told you accurately. They were published in Poultry magazine because Frost was a chicken farmer in New Hampshire, in Derry, New Hampshire. He had no luck throughout his life when you think about it. There's a guy born with a small family, just as him and his sister, in San Francisco. His father was the editor of the San Francisco News, and his mother was a Scottish woman. And she was, very shy, spoke with a very thick Scottish accent. And Frost said he would trail around after his father. He was a city boy, not a country boy, right? Grew up, first 11 years of his life in the city of San Francisco. His father was a really mean, ornery, very skeptical, atheistical Harvard graduate journalist. He had on his desk, he had a jar of formaldehyde in which were suspended a pair of bull's testicles. And he said this sent a message to people coming to ask him things. I've always wanted to get that at Middlebury College. I thought I'd do better with the students if I had bull's balls on the table. "Don't go to see Professor Parini." Is that the one with the bull's balls? And he kept a pistol in his drawer. So he was an ornery guy. So Frost's father, who came from Massachusetts, Lawrence, Massachusetts, where his father ran the mills there, and he was a kind of upper classy Harvard graduate, but he was a really hard-bitten, skeptical journalist. Now, Belle Moody Frost, Frost's mother, was from Scotland, and she was a Swedenborgian. She belonged to the Swedenborgian church. I mean, I've never seen a Swedenborgian church. They must exist. But Swedenborg, Emanuel Swedenborg, was a 17th century Swedish mystic. And she had Frost go with her to the Swedenborgian chapel. And Swedenborg was the guy who said, all nature is a correspondence. Every natural fact has a parallel in some spiritual fact. And so we must always be keeping in mind the spiritual connection to the natural world. And I always really firmly believe that Frost's unique viewpoint, the tone in his poetry, comes from that hard-bitten, pain-in-the-ass, skeptical, atheistical father, and the mystical Swedenborgian mother with that attachment to the natural world. And I think it's that amazing balance that Frost always holds that makes his poetry so vivid. And Frost, of course, was an ornery son of a bitch. He went to Dartmouth and what happened is his father died when Frost was only 11 and a half. And the family had no money, so they threw themselves on the good mercy of the Frost grandparents in Lawrence, Massachusetts. The grandparents took Frost and his mother and his sister in, and he was raised there. He was a brilliant boy. He studied Latin and Greek and graduated first in his class. Actually, he divided the valedictorian honors with his wife, Eleanor Frost. They met in high school, and they got married shortly thereafter. And Frost went up to Dartmouth. And Dartmouth, I used to teach at Dartmouth, taught there for years in the 70s and early 80s. And they made such a big deal out of Frost at Dartmouth. He hated Dartmouth. And he lasted there very briefly, one semester, and he said, "To hell with this place." So he got out. Well, the getting was good. And went down and taught elementary school for a while. And then he got into Harvard to try again. And he studied Latin and Greek at Harvard. And he only lasted a year and a half. And he said, schools and I just don't get along. And so he dropped out. Never had a degree, although he did get 275 honorary degrees. You know, when he was getting his honorary degree at Oxford, he said, "As you can see, I've been educated by degrees." But he hated school. He actually hated school, being a student. He liked being a professor, where he was a true pain in the ass. You know, he taught at Amherst mostly. And there were wonderful accounts of these classes of his that would go on. He would start talking to a small group, and an hour would pass, 2 hours would pass, 3 hours would pass, and nobody would dare say a word. Because first of all, Frost liked to monologue. He was a terrible monologuist. In researching my biography of Frost, which I did off and on for 25 years, I talked to hundreds of people that knew Frost. And over and again, I heard stories. A woman from Middlebury said, "Oh yes, Mr. Frost came to read at Mead Chapel 1947. And after his reading, he sort of turned to me and said, 'Would you like to take a walk?'" And "What are you going to say to Robert Frost?" She said, "Yes." She said, and we started walking. We walked all the way past Cornwall, all the way to Shoreham, turned around in Shoreham, and slowly made our way back. He dropped me off at my dorm at 5 in the morning. She said he never shut up the whole time. I said, "What was he talking about?" She said, "Oh my God, it went on about Emerson, Keats, Wordsworth, Shelley, you name it." Why? I would give my right arm to spend 12 hours walking with Robert Frost, hearing him talk about Keats, Shelley. I never met the man. I just talked recently to a woman who said, "Oh, I heard Mr. Frost read in 1954 at Breadloaf. He would always end the Writers' Conference, which he founded in 1927, he always insisted on giving the final reading, right? Because it was his conference, the Breadloaf Writers' Conference. And she said he came out, was a standing room only crowd in the little theater, and he ended with fire and ice. Some say the world will end in fire, some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. But if I had to perish twice, I know that if for destruction ice is also great and would suffice. She said, then he blew out the west doors there, walked down the lawn. It was night. He lit a cigarette and was looking up at the stars. And she said, they were all clapping. And she said, I followed him out. And I crept up to him, and he looked at me, and I said, Mr. Frost, Mr. Frost. She said, he turned to me and said, what do you want? She said, Mr. Frost, may I ask you a question? Go ahead. She said, Mr. Frost, that last poem you read, Fire and Ice, whatever does it mean? He said, whatever does it mean? It means this, darling. Some say the world will end in fire. He recited the whole poem to her again and said, now go to sleep. So that's what Frost was like. He was difficult. People have this image of Frost as this sweet, homely man, right? Very sweet, grandfatherly figure. But he was actually ornery, difficult. I always tell in my biography the story of 1938 Breadloaf Writers Conference, when his best friend who ran the conference, Ted Morrison, said, oh, the final reader this year, Robert, isn't going to be you. It's going to be Archibald MacLeish, who's the poetry consultant to the Library of Congress, which is a pretty big position. And famous, his poems are very popular these days. Frost said, all right, it's all right, don't worry about it, that's just fine, Morrison. And so Frost got there early with a big copy of the New York Times, sat in the front row, and he kept the seat next to him bare. You know the story. And as MacLeish is reading, one by one, Frost would crumple the pages of the New York Times loudly and put them on the chair, making a big pyramid of the poems of Robert Frost. And when MacLeish got to his most famous poem, Ars Poetica, which ends, a poem must not mean but be, Frost took out his matches and lit the pile of newspapers. And then he turned around and yelled, fire! And everybody ran out of the room. And afterward, poor old MacLeish came up to him and said, Robert, you're a very good poet, but you are a very bad man. And Frost said, Archie, with you, it's the other way around. Frost usually didn't miss a beat. He was tough. He was actually quite difficult. His daughter, Leslie, I remember interviewing her, and she said, oh, my God, one night my parents were fighting all night long in the farmhouse down near Bennington. And in the morning, I heard them screaming at each other all night long, raging. And Frost always made us breakfast, Daddy, and he came in and he said, all right, time for breakfast, kids. There were 4 of them. And she said he pulled the pistol out of the drawer where he kept right by the knives, which he always had a live pistol there, and he put it on the table. He said, Leslie, in 10 minutes, either I'll be dead or your mother will be dead. You can choose. That was pretty traumatic. I never did that to my kids, And if they say I did, they're making it up. So, Frost had a very difficult side to him. I got a story after story about how depressive he was. He would go for weeks on end when he would stay in his bedroom with the windows shut and wouldn't go out, curtains drawn. And then he'd go for weeks when he was like insisting everybody go for a 17-mile hike with him. So that's clearly, I'm not a psychologist, but it seems to me a form of manic depression or bipolar, something or other. He was, obviously suffering from something along those lines. And like I said, he was getting nowhere as a poet. So he doesn't graduate from Harvard. And his grandfather says, Robert, what are we going to do with you? You've married. You've got several kids here. What are you going to do? He said, I want to be a chicken farmer. So his grandfather buys him a little chicken farm in Derry, New Hampshire. And Frost moves in and starts raising chickens. And what really was the making of Robert Frost was he would go into the general store in Derry and listen to the other chicken farmers talk. And he said he learned to write poetry by listening to the other chicken farmers talk. Because he learned how the cadences of poetry could be found in the rhythms of ordinary speech. He loved the kind of metaphorical quality of that speech. He loved the rhythms of that speech. And he was able to get that kind of conversational quality, he called it the sound of sense, into his poetry. And that's what makes the poems stay with us, you know. We hear those words, they stay with us, you know. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not leave me watching here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. It's beautiful, that language, right? He gives his harness bell a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy winds and downy flake. You know, it's just gorgeous the way he does that. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. Poetry is memorable language, and Frost understood that by gathering the natural speech from local New Hampshire chicken farmers, he could somehow put that into poetry, the syntax, the turns of phrase, and also he put people in his poems. And there's hardly a poem of his that doesn't have at least one person in it. He once ran into the great poet Wallace Stevens at the Casa Marina Hotel in Key West. And he was very jealous of other poets. He once said he wished he was the only poet who was alive. He went over to Stevens and he said, "Stevens, your poetry is nothing but bric-a-brac." Stevens said, "Frost, your poetry has too many people in it." And you don't find a person in the poems of Wallace Stevens. Much, maybe, the man on the dump, but not too many people. So you couldn't imagine two more different poets. Wallace Stevens is a different subject, 350 pounds. He once got into a fight in Key West with Ernest Hemingway, and he beat him up by just simply sitting on him. But Frost got into fights too. One of his big fights was after his grandfather died in 1911, and Frost looked at his 4 kids and his wife, and he said, "I've just inherited enough money that I don't have to worry about making a living now. I don't want to raise chickens. I'm tired of these damn chickens. I never liked chickens anyway. I was always more interested in fruit trees." So he sold the dairy farm, and he moved. He said, "Let's go to England. I want to live under thatch in the cradle of the English lyric." And they moved to England for 4 years, and they lived outside of London and then down in the countryside in Gloucester, where Frost became friends with, he was almost 40 years old, with a very elite circle of poets. He met Yeats, but the most important meeting was Ezra Pound. You know, Ezra Pound was an incredibly major figure in modern poetry and modern art. He was the major kind of mentor of T.S. Eliot. He edited The Wasteland. He was the one, he helped Scott Fitzgerald. He helped Hemingway get his first work published. He was tremendously influential, also crazy, right? Truly mad. Ezra Pound was finally asked because he was ignored he wrote to Roosevelt and told him he knew how to stop World War II. And Roosevelt didn't reply to him, so he got furious, and he went and made broadcasts for Mussolini. And then when the American army invaded Pisa, Italy, they captured Ezra Pound and put him in a cage in Pisa. Then he was brought back after the war to America, put on trial for treason, condemned to death. And, of course, Robert Frost and Hemingway and Eliot intervened with the president, Truman, at the time, and got him put into a mental hospital. He was declared clinically insane, put into a mental hospital for 10 years, Pound. And then 1958, when he went back to, Frost went to Eisenhower and said, please let my old friend Ezra Pound go. And he pardoned him, but he said he's got to be deported. So he went to the ship. The photographers were there. Pound's ship withdrew from the harbor in New York, and Pound went like this. Heil Trump. So it's wild. And this whole story is a sidetrack, but it's a plug for my book of poems, which I want you to buy afterward. Because I have a poem in there about how in 1969, I decided, if I'm going to be a poet, I must go and live in Venice for a while. I was living in Scotland for 7 years. So I went down to Venice, and for a month I put up in a kind of a really ramshackle bed and breakfast. It was a pensione. And I remember eating my breakfast, and the ceiling kept falling with plaster onto my plate. And I would go outside and write poetry on a little table by the canal. And I loved it sitting there. I felt like a real poet. I was like 22. And 21 actually. And I was talking to Giorgio, who was the waiter. We became friendly rather quickly. I said, I'm an American. I'm here writing poetry. Blah, blah. And this old man walked by and would walk by me every day. And he had a grizzly old beard. He had a big hat on, a cape, and he always had a little cane like this. And I suddenly realized he was mumbling something to himself. And so every day he'd come by and I'd listen to him. And I heard, no. Mitrizzo del mattino nostra vita mi ritrovai. And I said to Giorgio, Giorgio, he's reciting poetry. He said, yeah, he's reciting. He comes by here every day and recites Dante's Inferno as he walks by. I said, God, he's a crazy old guy, but wonderful. He said, well, he's an American. He writes poetry. I said, what's his name? He said, his name is Ezra Pound. Oh, my God. So I wrote a poem about that, about sitting there every day watching Ezra Pound go by with his cane, reciting Dante's Inferno. But Frost took his poems to Pound in London and said, look, I've got these 2 manuscripts, A Boy's Will, North of Boston. Nobody wants to publish me. I've tried every publisher in America. They hate me. And is there anything you can do? Pound he said, well, let me read these manuscripts. Pound read the manuscripts and said, you know what? This is great stuff. I know a publisher here in London. It's a very tiny press. They'll just do a handful of copies. But I'll review the book in America, and we'll get you published. And so it worked. He got his poems published by the tiniest little press in London. And then Pound wrote these, not one, but several laudatory reviews in American papers. And Henry Holt's wife, Mrs. Holt, from big New York publisher, saw one of the reviews and said, I want to read that, got the book, gave it to her husband and said, Henry, publish this guy. And so the book came out in 1915 and was on the cover of the New Republic, great new American poet. And Frost, from that moment on, was really off and running, and he was over 40 years old. So I remind my students of that. I say, don't be in such a rush. Frost was over 40 when he got published. And really it took him between age of 40 and the age of 50, from 1915 to 1925, 1930 even, to make his reputation. And he made that reputation by going around and giving readings. One of the people I quote in my book was Allen Ginsberg, who told me Frost invented the poetry reading in America in a big way. He understood how to go and put on this Robert Frost act. Robert Frost, Yankee Farmer. I interviewed one guy who knew Frost in England, and he said, I once went with him to an Oxford high table college for dinner, and he said, you know, Frost spoke with the most perfect English accent. You would never know that he was an American. Very sophisticated, perfectly English accent, you know. But he wrote to his friend, one of his old students that he knew back in the U.S., where he taught a little high school when he was chicken farming, John Bartlett, and he said, I'm coming back to America, 1915, my book's coming out, and I intend to get Yankeeer and Yankeeer. And so by the end of his life, he had become such a Yankee. Yeah, listen to him talk, you'd never know that he once talked like the Queen, right? Frost would shapeshift. Here's a guy born, raised in San Francisco. Chicken farmer who goes to England and puts on an English accent while he's there. And then he comes back and he gets himself another farm. He has this money from his grandfather. It's not a lot of money, but it's enough to keep him pretty much throughout his entire life. So he taught, but he always had enough little extra money there from his grandfather's inheritance to keep going. Was he a good farmer? One woman I interviewed in New Hampshire said he was the worst farmer in New Hampshire. She said they wanted to take a legal action against him in Franconia because he wasn't milking his cows. The plants would go to seed. Frost didn't give a damn about the farm. He liked apple trees, but he more liked them because he could write a poem like After Apple Picking, right? I can't imagine Frost really spending time mending walls. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that sends the frozen ground swell under it. Well, that's Frost, isn't it, that breaks the wall? Frost was a playful poet. And also, Frost is he's such a playful poet, you don't know what he means half the time. You think you do, but you really don't. If you think you know what Frost means, he's probably fooled you. Famous poem, 2 roads diverged in a yellow wood. And sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down one. I'll go do my Frost voice. I actually summon Robert Frost, right? Come, Robert. And looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other as just as fair. Though as for that, the passing there had worn them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay in leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day. Yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever look back. I shall be telling this with a sigh. Somewhere ages and ages hence, 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the road less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. My high school English teacher, Miss Mayer, she had written out by hand, I took the road less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. And she had glass, and she put it up on the wall above her desk. I'll never forget her, West Grand High School, saying, class, Frost has tells the truth. March to the beat of a different drummer. Be your own person. Do your own thing, and it will make all the difference. Bullshit. Frost knew it was bullshit, and the poem is saying, what bullshit? If you're going to believe this, you'll believe anything. It's called Reading. 4 stanzas, 2 roads diverge, okay? You stand there, you look down one as far as you could, and then took the other, we're in the first stanza still, as just as fair. Not more fair, not less fair, as just as fair. So, second stanza begins, let's look at it closely. Let's read the damn poem and not imagine what we're seeing there. And as for that, the passing there had warned them really about the same. Okay, same here, same here. Third stanza, in case you have any doubt by now, he begins the third stanza, and both that morning equally lay in leaves no step had trodden black. Step on the yellow leaf, it turns black. Nobody has walked over there. Nobody has walked over there. Right? Then this bullshitter comes out and says at the end, I took the road less traveled by. But look at the 3 lines before he says that. He says, I shall be telling this with a sigh. You'd better, Robert Frost. You're lying Ted. You're lying Robert. And but unfortunately, you know you're lying. That's the most pregnant sigh in English literature. Oh, I shall be telling this with a sigh. You better be. Because you've got your grandchildren around your knee. You're an old guy. You're going to say, grandchildren, it's your old grandpappy here, Robert Frost, 4-time winner of the Pulitzer Prize, cover of Time magazine, the man who spoke at the Kennedy inaugural. And I took the road less traveled by. Bullshit. But he wants you to believe that, and he also knows the truth, that we will, every one of us, I see quite a few white hairs in this room. I'm almost 70 myself, and I even have a grandchild, and I say over and over again, oh, I took the road less traveled by. And believe me, that's my line. I took the road less traveled by. I became a poet, a novelist, a professor. Oh, it's such bullshit. But we want to invent all these stories of our lives, right? But it's got a lot of wisdom in it, this poetry, too. Like, I love that line, oh, I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way. I doubted if I should ever come back. I had a kid come into my office this year in the fall. I was his advisor, and I said, how's it going? He said, well, I'm feeling kind of nervous. I said, why are you nervous? He said, well, here I am at Middlebury. Duh. He said, I was accepted at Amherst as well. I said, okay, but what happened? You came to Middlebury. He said, yeah, I came to Middlebury, but I was really questioning last week to my mother whether I should have gone to Amherst. But she said, Stuart, if you go to Middlebury and you don't like it, go for a year. If you don't like it, you can transfer to Amherst, right? And he said to me, Professor, what do you think about that? I pulled Robert Frost off my shelf, and I said, knowing how way leads on to way. I doubted if I said, you can't go. I said, do you really think you could go back to Amherst next year and be a freshman again? You'd have miss your friend. You would have different friends. It'd be a totally different experience. I said, this is the nature of life. We always stand at this crossroads, and if you come to a fork in the road, take it. You take the road, and then you live with it, because you can't go back. Oh, I kept the first. Frost is bullshitting us again. Oh, actually, it's quite true. Oh, I kept the first for another day. I'm sure he did. He always thought, I wish I could have done this, that, or the other thing. But there's the wisdom in the literature there, knowing how way leads on to way. I doubted if I should ever come back. That's the greatness of Frost. I mean, it's a very rare poet that can frame truth in very clear language like that, and who can actually give us a moral that we can follow, and also give us the wonderful language that we keep living with. I always say to people, living as I've done for 40 years now in Dartmouth and Middlebury, New Hampshire and Vermont, Robert Frost is a kind of Bible to me. I mean, it's never that I drive down the street, any season of the year, that I don't think of Frost. If it's spring, I'm thinking of mending walls. I just want to get out there and mend a wall. The line, spring is the mischief in me. If it's summer, I think, midsummer and a midwood bird, that wonderful poem, The Oven Bird. I love that poem. Loud a midsummer and a midwood bird who makes the solid tree trunks sound again. I just had a student this year who wrote a poem about The Oven Bird by Frost, under the unfortunate impression that it was about a Thanksgiving turkey. It's amazing how far wrong you can go as a reader of poetry. Why I gave him a B, I'll never know. But I said it took some ingenuity to turn that poem into a Thanksgiving turkey poem. So I know I'm a very generous grader. Peter will be glad to hear that. Peter, he's taking my class. You're going to be okay. Forget the last paper. What did it say? You're all right. But, if it comes October, I'm thinking, oh, mild October morning mild, oh, something October morning mild. I mean, there's a poem for every season. Or winter, I think of the old man's winter night, the old man in his cabin up in the woods with nothing around him. But he looks up in the stars, and it's an incredible poem of isolation and absolute death and silence. I mean, an old man's winter night. All out of doors look darkly in on him. Whew. How does he come up with those lines? Poem after poem of Frost passes the envy test. You read it and you say, why didn't I think of that? A few years ago, I had the privilege or onerous duty of teaching those Frost kids who broke into the Frost cabin. You're aware of that, right? Some teenagers from Middlebury, 30 or 40 of them went up to the Frost cabin and they practically burned it down. They had a party up there and they used some of Frost's furniture and books and sort of lit a fire and one of the walls burned out. And they were caught. And the judge called me the night before the sentencing and said, Professor Parini, you don't know me, but I'm Judge so-and-so, and I'd like to offer them either a choice of going to jail or taking a course in poetry from you. Sad. And one of the kids who was the leader, the ringleader, said, I'd rather go to jail. So I did meet with the kids, and it was challenging. One of the kids, they're all sitting there, poor things, teenagers. I've had 3 teenagers. I know what they go through. Pimples, the works, the baseball caps on backwards. And there was one girl sitting in the front row, and I thought, she was looking at me so sadly. And I said, you, in the front row. She said, me? I said, do you even know who Robert Frost is? She said, I know who Abraham Lincoln is. I said, well, that's a start. Let's begin with that. It was tough. And so I said, what you're not understanding is poetry is about life and death. I said, you can get through your life so much better if you have a few good poems under your belt. If you understand how this language is adequate to our experience and can actually be transformative. And so I remember reading to them, I said, let's just turn to this one poem. I passed it out. Anybody recognize that quotation? Not a one hand goes up. Life is but a out, brief candle. Life is but a walking, blah, 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 shadow. Poor player that frets itself upon the stage. And this, a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Okay, so the buzzsaw snarled and rattled in the yard and made dust and dropped stove-length sticks of wood, sweet-scented stuff when the breeze drew across it. And from there those that lifted eyes could count 5 mountain ranges, one behind the other. My favorite line in all of Frost, under the sunset far into Vermont. Beautiful line of iambic pentameter. And the saw snarled and rattled, as it ran light or had to bear a load. And nothing happened. Day was all but done, call it a day. I wish they might have said to please the boy, by giving him the half hour that a boy counts so much when saved from work. His sister stood beside him with her apron to tell them, Saba! At the word, the saw, as if to prove saws knew what supper meant, leapt, or seemed to leap, leapt out at the boy's hand. However it was, he must have given the hand. However it was, neither refused the meeting. But the hand. The boy's first outcry was a rueful laugh. As he swung toward them, holding up the hand, half in appeal, but half as if to keep the life from spilling. Then the boy saw all, since he was old enough to know. Big boy doing a man's work. Though a child at heart, he saw all spoiled. Don't let them cut my hand off. Don't let him cut my hand off, sister. The doctor, when he comes, don't let him, sister. So, but the hand was gone already. The doctor put him in the dark of ether. He lay and puffed his lips out with his breath, and then the watcher at his pulse took fright. No one believed. They listened at his heart. Little, less, nothing. And that ended it. No more to build on there. And they, since they were not the one dead, turned to their affairs. You hear how horrible that is? How shocking that really happened to Frost in Franconia. Boy, 14, 15-year-old boy on the neighboring farm, cut his hand off. The doctor came, put him in ether, which is not what you necessarily should do to somebody in shock, and he died. Although, I always say to students, this might not have been the best. Why are they so quickly? They who were not the one dead turned to their affairs. Frost understood about subsistence farming. This was, a world where, horses and buggies and very little food and no income, and what you lived on what you could make and you grow, and also you would freeze to death if you didn't put up the wood. And, if you were lucky, you might have a hired hand. It's a metaphor, right? Metaphor. And without a hand, this boy becomes not just a hired hand, not just an extra hand, but he becomes somebody who is draining the family system, making it impossible, difficult for the family itself to survive the winter or life. So they who were not the one dead turned to their affairs. Frost does have a kind of sharpness that way. There's something, and I think that's that's Frost's father talking. And they who were not the one dead, turned to their affairs. Fortunately, Frost's not always like that. There's a kind of lift-off in so many of his poems. He did poems like Birches. He has such a wonderful sense of the winter woods. And there's never a time when you don't feel like with Frost you're actually wandering out into the woods with him. He takes you by the hand. I've read these poems now over and over throughout my life. I was recently down in my old hometown of Scranton. I remember my old high school teacher in 9th grade, Miss Ann Morris, said to me when I was 15, "Jay, you're going to write a paper this weekend on the poetry of Robert Frost." I said, "Oh my God, I'm so screwed." And I took the poems back to home and I read them. The first time I read poetry seriously, and I was so amazed. Whoa, a whole world opened up to me. This little blue-haired lady giving me these poems to read. I was just saying this, they just opened the Scranton Arts Center, and I said I was given these poems by this little blue-haired lady, and this woman stands up in the crowd of 300, and she said, "I'm Miss Ann Morris." She said I was 27 at the time. All right. Sit down, Miss Morris. You're well preserved. To me, she was a little old blue-haired lady. Oh, well, what the hell. But I was 15. A 27-year-old when you're 15 looks like an old lady, I hate to tell you. That's just the truth of it. But, I remember reading, Birches and After Apple Picking. When you think of it, Frost said, how many poems Frost really left us? I'll end right here and take your questions. But Frost said, all I ever wanted to do in my life was lodge half a dozen poems where they couldn't easily be got rid of. And he's got Fire and Ice, he's got The Road Not Taken, he's got Stopping by Woods in a Snowy Evening, he's got Mending Wall, he's got Birches, we're up to 5. But really, truly great final poems like Directive, and you can go on and on and on. I basically memorized these collected poems of Frost, and there's never anywhere you can go. Servant to Servant, Death of a Hired Hand, Things like, and some odd poems like, that one, provide, provide, the witch, that's an amazing poem, provide, provide. Doesn't seem like Frost at all. I'll end with that one because it's so amazing. Provide, a poem that you never really associate with Frost, but it's just such an amazing poem. Provide, provide. All I have to do is find it, and I will have it for you. It's an amazing poem. I could say it by heart, but I don't want to trust myself. Oh dear, I wish I could find it so easily, but I can't seem to. Oh well. Oh, here we go, 280. Okay, because I don't want to try it from memory because I'll just forget it, but I do know it by heart. Okay, provide, provide. I love this poem, provide, provide. And this is Frost's Depression-era poem. He hated Roosevelt. He didn't think the government should provide for people. He said, provide for yourself. You'd end the poem, he'd always end, provide, provide, and then he would say at a reading, or else someone else is going to provide for you, and you're not going to like it. Okay. Everything you know about life is in this poem. The witch that came, that withered hag, was once the beauty, to wash the steps with pail and rag, was once the beauty, Abishag. The picture pride of Hollywood. Too many fall from great and good for you to doubt the likelihood. Die early and avoid the fate. Or, if predestined to die late, make up your mind to die in state. Make the whole stock exchange your own. I read this last summer at the Basin Harbor Club, and one old codger yelled, "Oh, I did!" Make the whole stock exchange your own. If need be, occupy a throne where nobody can call you crone. Some have relied on what they knew. Others on simply being true. What worked for them might work for you. No memory of having starred atones for later disregard or keeps the end from being hard. Better to go down dignified with boughten friendship at your side than none at all. Provide, provide. So why don't you provide for me and clap? Thank you. Oh, you're good providers. Now, some of you probably have a question. What can I answer for you? Please. Mr.
Jerry, certainly a lot has been written about Frost, and certainly you've studied him for years.
Yes.
Are there questions that you still have about Frost? And if he invited you to lunch, what would you ask him?
Oh my God, what a great question. Yeah, people often assume I met Frost, and
And he died, what, 60?
he died in 63 or so, and I was, in junior high school. He wonders, if I were to meet Mr. Frost, would it be a question I would ask him? What would I really want to know? I have a million little questions about details of poems that I would probably, as a scholar, dig into. But it's often difficult when you meet the great man to know what to say. I never know what, I'm always tongue-tied in those situations. When I was an undergraduate student, my old mentor, Alistair Reid, took me to London. He said, "I'm going to take you to dinner with someone." He took me to dinner with Pablo Neruda, the great Nobel Prize-winning Chilean poet. And I was like thinking, oh my God, what am I going to ask him? And I said, "Mr. Neruda, I know that you ran for the presidency of Chile. You worked for 5 years to become president of Chile. And you famously walked from the north of Chile to the south of Chile, from village to village, shaking hands, introducing yourself to the entire country. And at the last minute, you withdrew from the race and threw your support behind Salvador Allende." I said, "Why did you do that? Why did you suddenly stop campaigning?" He said, "Because my feet were killing me." So I fear that Robert Frost would say something like that. One would never get a straight answer from Robert Frost, is the truth. Another question. Don't be shy. Yes.
Do you know, with your knowledge of poetry, of a more purely spontaneous line than the last line of Vanishing Red?
There's a line in The Charge of the Light Brigade by Tennyson that goes like this. Boom, 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 boom. That's the most spontaneic line in all of literature. Be careful what you ask me. I know things. I'm so damn knowledgeable. Who has a question? Nobody else? Here you got your big chance. There you are, sir.
Stopping by woods.
Snowy evening.
I heard from a professor one time that the last two lines are repeated.
Yeah.
He was unable to figure out what he could end the poem with.
Mm-hmm.
And his wife told him, why don't you just repeat?
That's true.
It is.
That poem sat on his desk for endless years. And, it ended, the woods are lovely, dark. I once looked at the various versions of the poem in the manuscripts of the Dartmouth notebooks, and you'll see the woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and still I wonder why I weep. That didn't work, he crossed it out. And still I wonder, should I keep? No. I sometimes wonder if I'll sleep. No. And what we sow, we often reap. No. You wouldn't believe the infinite varieties. And finally he said to his wife, I've got this amazing poem, but it doesn't have a last line. She said, let me look at it. She said, okay, the one before it's pretty good, and miles to go before I sleep. Repeat it. That was it. So sometimes the solution lies right before us. There was another question. Yes, sir.
The story about the inaugural?
The inaugural. Well, Stuart Udall, who was going to be the Secretary of the Interior, right? He came to Kennedy 4 months before the inauguration, said, I have a great idea. We've never had a poet read at an inauguration. Let's get Robert Frost to read a poem at the inauguration. And Kennedy said, oh, he's an old ham. And that's all they'll remember is that Robert Frost read at the inauguration. They'll forget who even was inaugurated. And Udall said, no, please, he's great. You love his poetry. He represents America. So Frost, of course, inauguration comes. It's bitterly cold. Frost comes out like this. He says, all right, I'll read this poem. I can't see the letters, the words. Oh, God, no. Lyndon Johnson comes over, puts his top hat to shade the sun. Frost goes like this. He says, oh, can't see it. Let's just see if I can draw it from memory. Frost knew every one of his poems by heart, believe me. He used to say, if they won't stick with me, I won't stick with them. So then he goes, the land was ours before we were the land. So forth. It was great. The next morning, Washington Post, big headline, old poet captures the heart of the nation. Second story down, slightly smaller letters, Kennedy inaugurated. He knew what he was doing. Well, listen, you've been a great audience, so some of you might be inspired. I can tell you my poems are not nearly as good as Robert Frost's, but some of them are moving in the right direction. So I hope you might buy one, but thank you all.